My name's Finn. I'm a doctoral student in philosophy here at UNSW, sort of a part-time tutor as well, though not specifically at the moment. I work out of the Department of Humanities and Languages. I'm on my second year of my PhD, and I've been at UNSW for about 6 years in total. Hello everyone. Well, so I'm working on the German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt, who she's a very important figure in a 20th century political theory. She's having a bit of a moment in scholarship, like currently, at most Anglophone unis. If you study philosophy, political theory, you'll encounter Hannah Arendt. It's the reason for that is mainly like sort of like Trump era politics. Like a lot of people see her as predicting a lot of the trends that became sort of current then, but that's not an aspect of the thought that I'm particularly interested in. And while I would be sort of averse to trying to say like, here's my particular argument because it's like next week it will be like slightly different. Yeah. Broadly, I'm looking at the, and what I told you before was the period in her work sort of around the 40s to the 50s, where she had by that point sort of started to establish herself as a philosopher with a sort of coherent perspective on the world that you could say is like Arendtian. Like she had her own ideas about things that underwent a dramatic, personal in some sense, but also like theoretical overhaul with her own experiences during the Second World War. And she drew a huge amount of conclusions. Her first major book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, was published in 1953, I believe, and that was entirely dealing with her perspective on totalitarianism and Nazism in Germany and what she saw as the quote-unquote origins of it. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say like, well, if you take what sort of elements were in her thought prior to that experience, and then take how they were changed, could you create sort of like a long sort of like a way of interpreting her central concerns throughout her work as a whole? Because she wrote about a huge amount of topics that it's often quite difficult to relate it all together. And so I suppose like my PhD is quite generic in that sense, because it's just trying to find a way of interpreting that allows one to read a philosopher's entire set of works in a coherent way. But I'm taking a sort of more historical, more biographical approach in some sense, but also trying to say that all her later works you can see as being downstream of that essential period in her life and the concerns that she hit on there, and that everything she was trying to do in later works is specific elaborations and changes of her perspective, but very much she never really diverts from that essential set of questions she's asking in that period. That's what my PhD is on. So Arendt, she was famously didn't anchor herself in any particular sort of like set of ideas at all. She basically, she had a famous interview where she says like, the only thing I consider myself like a part of or subscribing to is German philosophy. She wrote about a whole range of topics, but she never explicitly identified herself as like a Marxist or a like Republican thinker or an existentialist, or all of these traits that have been put onto her in sort of the years following. But to speak about her particular influences, she came very firmly out of the sort of like early 20th century German intellectual tradition that was like Karl Jaspers, who's a big figure in German existentialist thought, and Martin Heidegger, who is debatably a figure in German existentialist thought. And so much of her project, what she was doing in that time, was really sort of like downstream of those figures and what they were writing about. Also, Christian Platonic philosophy, like work of Augustine, and a whole bunch of other figures like that. Aristotle as well. So she kind of soaked up a whole range of influences. But like to say like what I think you could say her project was like as it started to emerge. So Heidegger, his sort of perspective is he thought the history of philosophy had become too overly concerned with difficult problems or questions or ways of interpreting that didn't get anyone anywhere. And so he wanted to start with the everyday experience of being, which is what I was talking about before. Like what he calls it the pre-ontological. So what can be said about the human way of being before one starts asking questions about like why or how or like what we should do, like what is the basic sort of experience of what it means to inhabit like a human world. He thought we should start there, and I kind of and this is just like my interpretation, I see Arendt as trying to do that, but in a sort of political way, like she's trying to reach an everyday or sort of primordial understanding of what it means to like inhabit a society specifically, not just so Heidegger is very metaphysical. He's concerned with what it means to attach meaning to things and what it means to be meaningful or be human, whereas she is more explicitly talking about the everyday experience of the political or of society in that regard. What does it mean to inhabit a specifically constructed human world of social relations and relationships, what it means to act politically, what it means to be concerned with the world rather than just being aware of it. And I think you can see that very early on in her thought, although what happens with the Second World War is she starts seeing, if we take sort of like the basic principles of what it means to be a sort of like a human actively in the world alongside other human beings, what can we sort of, what sort of political sphere should we build? And that's sort of what her thought becomes concerned with in her later works, I would say. And so she kind of like, she tries to find out like what the limits of current understandings of what it means to be human or what it means to be part of a community. She tries to establish the boundaries of those and the limits of those from who such communities exclude. So she was a refugee. She fled to France during the Second World War. She was Jewish, and so she had to flee from Germany where she'd grown up. And so a lot of her work in that 40s and 50s period is concerned exclusively with how sort of Western European conceptions of community and human value could not account for particular groups of people, and that constituted their downfall. And so basically she's trying to access this primordial interpretation of politics and of community that doesn't have any sort of like historically contingent marker attached to it. Like, so trying to it's trying to establish this pre-working of politics where people just live with other people and there's no sort of attachment to it. Like, one doesn't have to be a particular nationality, one doesn't have to be a particular sort of person in that regard. Because she takes like what she calls plurality as like just a fact of human existence. Like, people are just different from one another, and part of living in the human world is embracing that. Not only like different groups, different people with different backgrounds, but just different individuals in that regard. Right. And she sees any attempt to control that or place restrictions on that in like in the communal sphere as being like not just a morally bad thing, but also just anti-political. Right. Like it's just a complete distortion of what she sees the point of community is, to try and deny people particular entry. And that's why she thinks you can determine what the problems are in a society by what sorts of people a society excludes. Right. Because that reveals, because if you take plurality as axiomatic and then you get a particular political community where some people aren't allowed into that community, Arendt would say that whatever sort of status is allowing those people not to enter that community is a denial of the reality of the human political experience, in a way. there's a phrase that's like kind of a sort of a popular thing in Arendtian scholarship. It's the I can't remember where she specifically said it, but it's the name of a collection of unpublished writings or sort of variably published writings. It's called Thinking Without a Banister. So being like authentic in the existential sense, which I'll just say like authenticity is like a specific concept in existential thought. You find it in Heidegger, you find it in Sartre. And what it basically means is like is the sense of like not necessarily being true to oneself, but allowing one the sort of freedom to determine what one's possibilities are or who the self is. So any sort of like believing that you're limited in some way, or even so there's like the case of like someone comes into the world, who they are, their self isn't determined. Their circumstances may be determined, and a lot of people will say that if you say like, oh well, we are who we want ourselves to be, well, some people come into a position where their economic circumstances don't allow them to fully develop themselves, and that's completely true, because Sartre would say that if we deny the circumstances we're born into, that's just as much living inauthentically as thinking that we are determined from those circumstances. But it is all about sort of negotiating and allowing oneself to sort of cultivate an individual perspective. And for Arendt, what that took the form of is like preserving, she sees the sort of communities as predicated on creating like very much like a physical but also a philosophical space where people are allowed to present themselves and engage in discourse and think and judge, and any society that tries to place restrictions on the nature of conversation or things like that, or the nature of different people's right and ability to engage in that conversation, as very much as anti-political, as I said. So living authentically, if there could be something to be attributed to Arendt that was along those lines, would be preserving that space where people can act and do and think and judge and create, like anything like that. And any restrictions on that is she sees as negative in that regard. Sure. So the Christian Platonic philosophy thing is Christian Platonic philosophy, of course, is Christian interpretations of Plato. Plato, very, very important Greek philosopher. His basic idea was that our reality exists as a sort of imperfect representation of a higher realm, which he called the realm of forms, in which there were the sort of like true and perfect versions of everything. So like the form of the good or the form of justice existed in these higher realms, so that everything in our world is a sort of representation of some essential nature to everything. And so, of course, for Christian philosophers like Augustine, it was very easy to take this. Well, this higher realm of the perfect form of everything is is divine in some way. Although she takes a lot from it, she does see it as an obstacle to the development of philosophy in a similar way that a lot of German philosophers historically saw religion as an obstacle. A lot of these people were religious, but like the main tension with people like Marx and so on was the idea that if we anchor sort of meaning and value in something outside of the human world, then that inherently reduces the value of the day-to-day human existence. Because if and there is of course a lot more complicated than this, but basically if we take the standpoint that one's life is judged as meaningful to the extent that it prepares one for an existence outside of this particular world, then that means that one's existence in the world is to some extent instrumental. And the German philosophers wanted to reject any view of what it means to exist as human as just an instrumental means to end thing. Like we perform good actions so that we can inhabit a better life in the next world or whatever. And a lot of German philosophers saw that as sort of reducing what it meant to be human. And this is something that you see recurring throughout. So like Heidegger, for example, he thought like one of the most important aspects of the human experience was finality, was death. And he called us being towards death. I can't remember what the German for that is. I think it's Sein zum Tode, I think, but it's probably completely wrong. But so it's that end, that non-being that offers the contrast to find meaning in our time in the world. And Arendt, like all sorts of figures of this type, would see any attempt to place meaning or value on something that is outside of the day-to-day relations between people as covering up that essential experience. They would want to see these things valuable in themselves. So Arendt sees politics insofar as it is politics. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about like federal politics, but she has a very Greek view of politics as just the day-to-day acting and discoursing with other people. Like politics is not just the profession for her, it's presenting yourself publicly to people, it's creating, it's engaging in a community in any way whatsoever. So producing art that is intended to be consumed by other people, that is intended to express yourself, is a political act in her view, because it's something that you do in public that is designed to be interpreted and seen by other people. So she has quite an abstract conception of politics. But anything that tries to make that meaningful insofar as it is subordinated to something else, she would see that as covering up the value of that experience. Like for her, that activity, that day-to-day interacting with one's community would have to be valuable purely in itself for it to be taken seriously as part of the human experience. And so if you take interpretations from religion that say that these things are only valuable if we align it in a way where we can create the potential for people to then go on to inhabit like a divine life afterwards, then that means that everything we do in the human world is A, subordinate to that, and B, only valuable insofar as it leads to that, if any of that makes sense. It's, as I said, it's all much more complicated than this, and like I'm not saying all Christian philosophy is like this, but this is certainly what she would see as the essential problem with it. Although she sees, like, she does draw a lot of positive things out of it. The sort of like, so she wrote her doctoral thesis on the Christian concept of love. So that interest in Christian philosophy is like, to her is it's right there from the beginning, which is interesting coming from a Jewish household. It was a secular Jewish household, but it's at the very least she really took to it in a way, even though she was never herself Christian. But the idea of loving other people as a way of like or as a way of wanting them to be better and to cultivate themselves, so that there's like this reciprocal thing of like, she calls it neighborly love or worldly love. It's just the appreciation of people insofar as so as to facilitate their actualization, or to make us like that basic communal experience of like making other people better people, and through that making yourself a better person. She sees that as something that is in Christian philosophy and is something that can be useful, but it's just the doing that so that we can live a better next life that she would take issue with, if you understand what I'm saying there.
Yeah.
In a way there isn't one, but that's kind of, and it might seem unsatisfied. There's a term in philosophy which is aporia, which is to describe things as aporetic, like it's left open to interpretation, or there's like a lack of certainty. So like and it's a big part of the history of philosophy in particular. Like as you go back to like all the earliest dialogues written by Plato, a lot of these function as Socrates or other figures having a debate on a subject and then leaving the ultimate answer completely open to interpretation. One could probably say that if Arendt wants to, and like other figures like Giorgio Agamben, who's an Italian philosopher who's very influenced by Arendt, he's quite prominent nowadays, if you want to sort of like encourage people to think for themselves and to think without banisters and to find ways to organize and participate in communal interaction and to facilitate sort of like self-improvement and the improvement of the conditions of others, that does not rely on sort of like aggressive, restrictive conceptions of like what reinforces that, then to supply a system for people to follow is almost completely against that. So there is a sense in that the apparatic or like the lack of resolution to how we should live in the way that she's promoting is the point. It's sort of and this will be unsatisfying to many people, I completely understand that, but by not giving an answer on how people can reach that, it sort of, it inherently brings it down to the agency of different people to collaborate and determine for themselves, which is ultimately like the source of, that's the basic idea of existential politics in general. It's like cultivating that autonomy so that people can sort of create systems that suit their circumstances or what they value in that regard. Of course, it can be quite chaotic because of that, but in a sense, like, one doesn't want to dismiss existing dogmas just to create a new one. Like, Sartre and Heidegger and Arendt don't want to say, like, all these ways of being are wrong, so here's my correct way of being. Like they want to, in a sense, they're what they are trying to do is part of the broader desire with philosophy in general. It's to educate and empower people so as to be able to interpret and engage. Because if you take Arendt's basic political experience as being about that mediation and contestation of like discourse, speech, and action and all that, to give people the correct answers for how they should govern themselves from the outset makes all of that pointless. In that way, the only answers she offers is to create that experience so that one can find their answers through that. It's I will say it's not like a feature of existentialism inherently to reject divinity. There is like a strong religious existential tradition. Kierkegaard, who is like whether or not he would have allied himself with like who we see as like the figures in existentialism like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, whether or not he would have seen himself as with them, you'll see him in scholarship as being called the first existentialist. And for him, his answer was some sort of like religious existence in that regard. That was what he thought was the solution. And there's a whole tradition of existential theorists who are very who bring that into their religious into their religions. So I'm thinking of so my perspective is from what I've read, which is living in the Western world, going to Christian high schools, is mainly Christian existential philosophers like Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, who I haven't read them extensively, but they are there. But regardless, the sort of the impulse is to see individuals. They call it like that. It's the idea that existentialism is a humanism. So it's not necessarily religion itself that's like inherently the problem, or the idea of divinity that's the problem. It's the sort of idea of having things. So like we come into the world in situation. Like we inhabit a world that is pre-constructed prior to our coming into it, and so there's all sorts of traditions and ways of living that are articulated down to us, and they would see that like the important thing is to try and take all that in, but also work out for yourself who you want to be. in that regard. They want to cultivate a profound sense of individual freedom to determine and to engage and to be concerned with the world in that regard. And so in that sense, the rejection of divinity is not necessarily a given, because as with Kierkegaard, if through that process of self-creation, actualization, that leads you to a particular religious faith, then that, by the existential project, is completely legitimate, because you are choosing that for yourself as what you see as the answers to the question. Right. And that is living authentically. But it's the idea of like, if you come into a world and you're given a set of ideas to believe, and you don't question them and you allow them to determine your lives because of that, that would be living inauthentically. Whereas if upon engaging with them and thinking seriously, you decide that they're all right anyway, then that is living authentically. But so there isn't a necessary sense that one has to reject divinity, but one has to choose it for themselves, is more the basic insight. Yeah, so Socrates, you'll actually see some sort of like goofy scholars saying is like, oh no, you can see the origins of existential thought as early on as in Socrates. Kierkegaard, Arendt, all sorts of philosophers wrote extensively about Socrates because they see that essential disposition. So for Arendt, who I can speak about, being who I'm most familiar with here, in her later work, when she's trying to uncover that sort of like basic everyday awareness of what it means to be a part of a community, she takes Socrates as like the sage-like example here, as someone who is concerned with the world, constantly encouraging people to question and to look for alternatives, not necessarily for the sake of going against what the customs are in society inherently, but just for like that inquisitive mind, that getting to the bottom of it, like as the main value. And of course Socrates, some people say that, like, you know, he went too far. I mean, historically, he was executed for corrupting the youth of Athens. So, of course, like, we want people to become inquisitive, but not so that they die. Yeah. But that basic commitment to being concerned with what values one has and the way in which one presents oneself to others and the way in which one treats other people or engages with media or with society, treating that seriously and not passively is what's important, really. And that's why you'd see it as you could see there are strong connections between that sort of the Socratic experience and existential thought. And I do think there's a lot of matchup here. It definitely can be. I mean, this is sort of a trend you'll see in philosophy and in like sort of like the global culture, I guess. Basically, from the 20th century onwards, like this like widespread sort of like sense of collapse of like traditional ways of understanding and like that. And so people will attach themselves to sort of like ideologies or ways of being that offer answers or offer sort of clarity where they found themselves previously so held back. And I think, say, to talk specifically about the rise of people becoming more spiritual, that can be a good and a bad thing. Like if people, I definitely think people should be open-minded with everything. Like you'll meet a lot of people who are sort of, they'll have a terrible experience with like dogmatic religion, and they'll become a dogmatic atheist in that sense, and will spend a lot of their time criticizing people who believe in religion at all. And I think that's negotiating between two ends of like of the extremes. Like I think if one finds themselves drawn to spirituality, it's not something that I personally have found. I read a lot of theology because I find it interesting, but not for personal sake. But if people find themselves drawn to spirituality because through like a sort of inquisitive process of reading and talking to other people and finding that those answers work for them, as I've said already, I think that's completely fine. But it's that commitment to self-reflection that's important. So for the whole Trump era thing, the thing that a lot of people tug on Arendt as her anticipating is the sort of the dominance of constructed narratives in the public sphere. So like if you take the basic premise that like there is no sort of like certain truth, then truth can be malleable to that degree. And so there is a sense in Arendt in which communities need to come together and decide what they regard as valuable. That's like the only way their autonomy can be preserved. But those narratives can, about what is true and about what is real, can take off and be co-opted by powerful figures or groups to be utilized against other people and against the autonomy of other people in the political sphere. So the idea of the post-truth world where no one believes anything the media is saying is certainly a symptom of that, because it's the idea that like once you get in your head the idea that like what a particular source is providing you as true is completely false, then it kind of undermines your way of engaging with reality. And I think the impulse to either latch on to particular groups that present a particular narrative of things that you see to be true and rejecting all other sources of potential truth is completely wrong. So like you see with like the whole election controversy in the US, there's the extreme narrative of it was stolen, it was rigged, and people who attach themselves very firmly to it. And it's something about, it would have to be, what insight you could bring from her from that would be to be inquisitive in the public sphere, to try your best to take in all sides, not in the sense of being passive or centrist, like of course, engage politically, engage in debate, take stances on things, but take stances because they're freely chosen and evaluated by you. Don't succumb to any one perspective for its allure or for its what it might have its intuitive appeal, and moreover, don't once you have a perspective, don't utilize that to criticize the earnest attempts of others to try and engage in their own process of like figuring out for themselves what to value and what's important for them. Any sort of attempt to control like the extent to which like people can engage in those sort of processes is a negative thing. So she would see like attempts to control like what sort of media people can consume as a bad thing, attempts to control like who can be represented in particular media as a bad thing, because it would have to be all in this constant process of mediation and self-actualization. And like, so there's the extreme of like completely removing from the public sphere people who have particular views, but there's also the sort of like letting communities congregate around views that have a really real and dramatic effect on the well-being of others. It's kind of like you can. It's not very easy to say like, as I've said already, like what sort of like way we should live because of that, because it kind of has to be up to us in that regard. But the basic example of being concerned with the world is being like involved in it, as being open to talking to other people and being open to hearing ideas alternative to your own, and consuming media and art and observing community in ways that it's not just subordinate to your own interests, but as meaningful and valuable in itself, like treating other perspectives as meaningful in themselves and not just for what they promote from you. Because if you treat everyone else's perspectives as only meaningful insofar as it allows you to develop yourself, then that's just as instrumental as subordinating other people to help you in some regard. It's hard to say, but like there's a disposition, I would say, that is probably what's most relevant to navigating the modern world that you can take out of sort of that German existential thought that we've been talking about. There is absolutely no way in which like Arendt possibly like anticipated the sheer insanity of like what it means to be concerned nowadays. I mean, the internet has opened. The internet's amazing because it's opened everyone to everyone's perspective all at once, but it's also insane because of that. Like, of course, it is. On one hand, it's just emotionally too much to try and constantly be switched on to what's going on like in the world in that regard. It is too demanding. And on the other hand, it can be a sign of privilege, like because a lot of people, because they either don't have access to the same sort of abilities to engage that other people do, or because they have their living conditions are poor, so that they have to work long hours in order to survive, basically. They're not able to maintain that sort of engaged perspective. And that's and so from that, like, you could go back to the sort of old insight that Sartre drew from and Simone de Beauvoir drew from it, where to become a concerned individual is to try and make it so that other people can become that concerned individual. So it's not just enough that I'm freeing myself. I need to change material conditions in the world so that other people can have that same freedom, essentially, because external conditions do have an impact on people's ability to cultivate themselves, to be able to engage. But the thing is, with Arendt, the way she sees it, to bring it back to the idea that she has a particular view of what it means to be political, she sees not being concerned with the world as a denial of the reality of human experience, I would say. Pardon me. So like, because being human is to inhabit the world, being human is inherently like to not engage with that in some sense. And this doesn't mean like consume all media, go on the internet all the time. It can be even as simple as like talking to other people, or just inhabiting a society, as being engaged with the world. But so like, if one gets in their head the idea of what it means to be a concerned person is to make sure you spend all your time on Twitter absorbing all the discussion, that's also the wrong idea, because it's just it's not necessarily like a way of approaching the world. It's just a necessity that she sees. Like, to deny that the world or that human experience is something that we should be concerned with is to deny reality. I would never expect people to be constantly switched on to everything. And when I say like, be a concerned person, be concerned with the world, I recognize that the easiest way to interpret that is to be like, oh, consume all media, be online all the time, follow the discussion, follow politics, and that can work for people, and definitely those are things that you should like be interested in. Like, I think people should always try to be consuming art, and try to be aware of their position in the world and the history of different communities around the world, trying their best to get the full picture. But I recognize not everyone's going to be in the position where they have the privilege to be able to devote extensive time for that. But it's that pre-ontological awareness of reality that I think Arendt would be more describing, where it's like, we have no choice but to be concerned with the world, and so we should make the most of that. We have no choice but to live in a place where there are people different from us, people who have different values, different histories, come from different life experiences, and to not be open to that is to deny their existence, or not only to deny what it means to be human, but also to deny their humanity. And so it can be a very abstract thing to try and apply in life, but that's probably the best way I would see it, is the kind of, we have no choice. And that being just sort of like trying your best to sort of like live in the world and treat existence and being human as meaningful is just as a valid way of taking that as trying to make sure you understand everything. There's a quote by Arendt where she says, I don't want to know, I want to understand. And that's the way I would say it. It's not about like having all the knowledge about like what's going on politically in the world. Like there are political situations around the world that I'm never going to be able to explain, and that would like maybe it would be good to have some awareness of them if I want to present myself as someone who is trying to educate people. But it's too demanding to try and ensure that people know everything about everything, I would say. And so one has to just do what they can with the circumstances they have, but also within that, work within those circumstances to try and cultivate a like better, more holistic experience for everyone in that regard.
I feel like
by all means, like contemporary politics can be hellish. Like any sort of discussions about media nowadays can be like toxic or whatever like that, and by no means people should absolutely like there's a big theme in Arendt of always like finding that space for reflection or for oneself, like people should always be able to take whatever moments they can to reflect on themselves and to occupy a distance from what's going on, because you need to take yourself out of it from time to time just for your own mental health. But the extreme of that would be to deny that it matters to you, and not any particular thing. Like, of course, like there are many people to which like what is going on like online doesn't matter, but to deny that like being a human inhabiting a world in which other humans exist and have their own perspectives and life experiences is something that is relevant to you. That would be where being concerned with the world is or being unconcerned with the world is a problem. Just living as a human is being concerned with the world in the German philosophical view, and so saying like, oh, I don't take an interest in that, I'm apolitical. One could make the argument that like you're living like inauthentically because I think everyone is interested in what it means to be human to some degree, but it's like how should I say this? Certainly wanting to distance yourself from like what's going on politically in the world can definitely be done without losing your sense of concern for the world, because it's a constant nightmare. I've probably said the same thing over and over again, but yeah, I don't know. It's the disposition, I would say, more than like a requirement that people do anything in particular. It's just that basic openness to whatever may be accessible and whatever may be one's particular experience that matters. Very vague, very abstract, but it's kind of like all one can say without prescribing how people should behave. Because when you say like being true to yourself, like you could have a completely wrong view of like who you are, or like because so much of who people are is shaped by their environments. It may like you may think you're acting in a way where you're being true to yourself, and then like years and years of like work and self-cultivation and development and just pure life experience down the line, you find you're a very different person to who you were back then, and like you're no less legitimately yourself. But so that's why I want to try and distance from the idea of like being like authentic to oneself, because that would presume that what oneself is this set in stone thing, and not this constant process of negotiating and experiencing and taking in as much as one can reliably experience in a lifetime. Like in some sense, to live authentically is just to live freely. It is that openness, that disposition I was talking about. It's not taking not only like your own possibilities at face value, but like one's like external influences at face value. To like read some pop existentialism and to be like, oh, I determine who I am, and like I determine who I want to be, and then like dogmatically adhering to what is solely like what you want out of anything, that can be just as bad. But it's that basic freedom to constantly see yourself as something that isn't set in stone, but as a sort of like evolving, to see your very sense of human being as like a conversation you're having, like internally and externally throughout your entire life. That's what I would see as the sort of as the existential authenticity. And of course, it's not something that can be taught, because like I can tell people to live authentically to themselves, but to some extent, their self is something that they'll have to work on and determine for themselves how they want to live their life. It's something that can't be, it's not something that can be abstracted from just the day-to-day existence. Like who we are is like what we do. And so Sartre would very much say that the way in which we act is a reflection of ourselves. So if someone doesn't think of themselves as like a cruel person, but their actions are cruel, then they are a cruel person, because it matters just as much on the sort of self-reflection as to how we present ourselves to other people. But it would be sort of like putting ourselves into a singular box, or to seeing our sort of like self-development as having an end point after which we keep existing as sort of the inauthentic experience. There's an idea in Arendt's work that like what it means to be human is determined by human communities. If we have a sort of prescription of what it means to be human that exempts certain people, then if we have groups of people whose only quality is that they are just basically human and nothing else, then that puts them in an incredibly precarious position. So like she talks about like the rights of man, like the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, like ideas of universal rights, that these are things that don't exist in a vacuum, but rather need to be upheld by particular governments and communities if they are to be real at all. Like, so the refugee crisis that she discusses in the sort of like interwar period and after the Second World War is that you had all these people who the Declaration of the Rights of Man had said that they have universal rights, but once there was no government to advocate for their rights, or no groups to advocate for their rights, it basically was as though they had no rights at all. And so all these films that portray like a very real and traumatic period in history in which societies exterminated entire populations, or attempted to control and construct the sort of communities they prefer to live with at the expense of other human beings who didn't fit that model and were sort of like reduced to a desolate, traumatic existence because of that. It's impossible not to connect it to the same themes that Arendt was talking about, because say in like Life is Beautiful and Come and See, and the like horrific things inflicted on the characters of those films, which were inflicted on real people, millions of people, it's a consequence of the same problems that she's identifying, like the ability of any one society to exterminate and dictate who is allowed to live in a society or who is allowed to be seen as a human, is very much falls in line with her explorations of like what it means to be human in the first place, and her decision to try and go back to a primordial humanness of just like, to be human is to be oneself among other people in the first place. And so that impulse to try and dictate who qualifies as human or who qualifies as a valuable human who I can live with is like anti-political, is anti-reality. And so she has a very strange criticism of the Nazis, where she sees them as like not only like committing heinous atrocities, but also denying the basic aspects of human existence, that we live amongst other people who are different to us in some ways and similar to us in other ways. So like in one of her most controversial books, Eichmann and Jerusalem, she condemns like a main architect of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, she was covering his trial in Jerusalem, hence Eichmann Jerusalem. And one of the main things she condemns him on is his mistaken assumption that he can dictate who he inhabits the world with, which she sees as not just disastrous in what the Nazis did because of that, but also just as a basic misconception of what it means to be human in the first place. So it's impossible not to see films that explore and deal and render those periods in human history in such like brutal clarity, and not connect it to the work of people who lived through and had to engage with the challenges of that time, and see how those challenges have not really adequately been solved in the modern world. In some ways they have, in some ways like we've gotten better, but there's still so much that left unarticulated because of that.
So what would you say?
There's a phrase from the philosopher Mark Fisher where he says, like, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember the particular phrase, but it's it's a protest that everyone attends. Like, you don't want to get into where you watch something and you like think about like, oh, that's so terrible, I can't believe that happened, and then that's done the sort of radical politics for you and you can get back to your life. So like, as long as you recognize that there are bad things in the world, it's okay for you to passively like continue on with your life, because you're aware that there are bad things there, so you give yourself the exemption to not do anything about it, because you like, everyone attends the protest, everyone knows these things are bad, so no one has to do anything about it, as long as we all recognize that it's bad. So like, for me personally, it's valuable to take from art that deals with intense suffering and like horrific periods in human history, to connect the dots from that to the ways in which little has changed for many people around the world today, and to like not take it sitting down in that regard, like not to watch a film that depicts a horrid situation and think, wow, that's awful, now I'll get back to the rest of my life once I stop thinking about that, but to be inspired to continue engaging with and trying to actualize the values that like a film like that presents, or learn and apply the lessons that it tries to teach. I could certainly do more, as everyone could. Like I try to be like politically active and involved, to collaborate and organize with people, like working with protests in communities. There are like political initiatives, like there's one that I've been involved with with a couple people at UNSW to try and set up an explicit help center for refugee and asylum seeker students here at UNSW, because they face incredible challenges, not only once they are like allowed to even like settle in Australia and in Sydney, to then be able to like find stable pathways to education which allow them to be able to face up to, or not face up to, but deal with the incredible challenges that are thrown their way by the sheer position that they inhabit. So it's a project that's led by a few different people at UNSW, some of which manage similar initiatives at other universities. Western Sydney University has a very highly developed refugee and asylum seeker student help center, and so the representatives at Western Sydney University are helping us out here at UNSW try and establish the same thing here, so more refugee and asylum seeker citizens in Australia can have the opportunity to come to UNSW, to be given the pathways that it offers, and to receive just as much of an experience of education and of public life as any other student at UNSW. But it's like things like that, like one has to kind of, if one wants to be concerned with politics, one kind of has to find ways to do things, whether that's becoming involved in student politics or with local politics or whatever. But my recommendation would be not to see like federal politics or high level politics as like the capital P politics, as like that's what real politics is. Like interacting with and organizing in one's own community is just as valuable, if not more so, than like professional politics in that regard, because that's where the real immediate consequences are going to be most consistently felt. That, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities on campus with student politics to like exert yourself politically. There's plenty of opportunities at the postgraduate level. Tons and tons of professors and lecturers are constantly involved in building projects to try and improve university facilities and opportunities in that regard. Yeah, I think for anyone who's like interested in how in like leaving a positive impact on the world, it's kind of hard to just maintain purely the mindset of wanting that to happen but not doing anything with it. Of course, like not everyone is in a position where they can act politically, or they can seek out and organize with people, and that's deeply unfortunate. And so for people who, like me, who are fortunate enough to come to an institution like this, who are fortunate enough to have the free time to engage in those activities, it's quite vital. Like politics is just one of many ways to sort of like make yourself a better and more communally involved person, supporting local artists, businesses as well, anything that sort of contributes not only to one sort of like sense of community in the local sphere, but also like openness to the idea of community more broadly. So just consuming art and media and creativity on a more abstract, generalized level, it all feeds into the same thing, which is just that sort of like, I come back to again, just that everyday experience of being human as meaningful in itself, which is what I personally take to be the basic insight that philosophy provides to me. Yeah, it's because it's partly not only because, but it's because politics has become so professionalized that it's like people have been given the perspective that to be political and to engage politically, they have to take up the career of being a politician. And like not only are those politicians then like the general public is alienated from them because they have these like wealthy positions in which they are like completely involved in it's professionalized in that way, and there's like a inherently soulless quality that comes because of that, like the idea that people are yes, definitely working to like change and improve lives, but also like making money from that to some degree. But professional politics is just one way of engaging with one's community. Non-professional or sort of spontaneous politics is another way, and it's an equally valid way of engaging with others and with developing oneself. And it's no less of a route to happiness and to improving the well-being of community in general.
Yeah, but
and it doesn't have to be politics in the way that we nowadays understand it, as that sort of like engaged in like activity for the sake of improvement. Like you can take the very abstract Arendtian view of politics as just anything that involves dealing publicly with others, and so like trying to work on relationships with other people, or like trying to address problems or help friends or family, like address problems that they're concerned about, or giving them the opportunity and creating opportunities for other families and friends to do that, is like it's all part of the same thing. It's just about being in the world, and about being concerned with the world in that way.
yeah, I really
Yeah, there is only a formal difference in my view between someone making a speech and about a particular issue and someone making an artwork that represents a particular issue. They're both statements in some regard. They both require different like approaches, but they're both political acts insofar as they are expressions of a person and concern with a particular topic. And that's why so much of like the most like profound like things that like a lot of the most profound insights that people glean about the world is through the medium of art, like through like anti-war paintings or whatever, like Guernica and the like, or anti-war media, or like any sort of topic media. A lot of the lessons that one tries to communicate politically, people can absorb just through art, because they're both political acts in the same way, I would say. Like, I think art is, by virtue of being like a way of human expression, political in that sense, because it involves other people and communication and discourse and expression, which I see as are all inherently political features. But it's just that this is a particular conception of what it means to be political. It's like we have the professionalized view of politics nowadays, whereas like I quite like Arendt's view of just political as being anything that takes place in like publicly, or is available to other people, or involves community in that regard. Well, Arendt has her own perspective. She, like, the public-private divide is something that is actually like quite an important feature of her thought. It's a very controversial feature of her thought, and one that can, in my opinion, lead to some problematic assumptions. So like a lot of the criticism of Arendt is that is about what she considers so private matters are things that are like sort of like solved by individuals in their own like private way. So she sees like family matters historically, so like the private sphere is the realm of the family, of the household, whereas the public sphere is like the political, like the realm in which you engage with people outside of your own internal lives. And for many, that can lead to a rigid separation where what problems one's encountering personally in one's own life are disconnected from broader societal issues, which is not often true. And so like the idea that, like, say if I'm personally having trouble like if I'm having problems at home, or like problems with my family, or like problems like making ends meet in my own private like day-to-day existence, I don't think one can see that as distanced from broader political concerns about society. I think there has to be some sort of malleability to the public-private sphere in that regard. But I think the opposition has to stay there insofar as people need mechanisms to bring problems to public attention in that regard. Like people like if people are experiencing problems in like their own private life, they need an avenue to either understand whether those are downstream of broader issues, and then if so, to bring that to public attention. And that's very difficult without those specific mediums of like the public sphere versus the private sphere. But I would personally I think it's antithetical to what Arendt's trying to do to like pin down the public and private sphere is defined by particular things in general. Like the public sphere is just in public, the private sphere is just like it's what's internal to people's lives. But any particular things like family structure, what like the ways in which like what one's entitled to do in the household, these are assumptions that I think are political in nature, and so the private sphere doesn't necessarily need to be structured as like a traditional family in that regard, and there are all sorts of problems you can get if you don't politically engage with like the household and the family as like constructs that have political relevance, and that are informed by history. Arendt's taking very much from this sort of like ancient Greek Athenian model where there's the household that is rigidly structured and like devoted to production and like that, and there's rigid hierarchy, but then there's like the public sphere in which everyone's equal, and there can be the impulse to then say that because we have this space in which everyone is equal, that doesn't necessarily mean that people need to be equal outside of it too. But like say patriarchal family structures or rigid social expectations that are provided through family structures, or like the models of what a household functions as, these are all things, as I said, that have political consequences, and if necessary should be given political avenues to make it into the public sphere. Like if people are experiencing limitations on their freedom by the particular structure that their family is structured as, that's something that is no less worthy of being brought to public attention than any other thing that is already in public attention. But you do, I think, need that understanding of the public sphere as this specific space in which people can politicize things in the first place, can make things valuable, or not necessarily valuable, can make things of concern to others. Because that's what ultimately bringing things from the private into the public is. It's revealing it in that regard. And problems can't be addressed if they aren't given that avenue to be revealed.
I think this private to public.
Yeah, that's a feature of Confucian thought, very specifically the idea that the family should model the politics, or that the politics should be predicated on the structure of the family. And I do think that trying to treat one's dealings with with the world in public, with other people, as not separate from how you internally treat yourself and your most immediate friends and relatives. I think seeing them as both as part of the same thing is very important. If one person advocates equality and freedom in public, and then is a very restrictive parent at home, I do see that as a genuine compromising of those beliefs. If you advocate people human rights and all that, and then you treat children as not as lesser than because they're young, that's a compromise of your political views, in my opinion. And so I do think that the home life and the public life need to be seen as affecting and reinforcing each other, but there also needs to be the avenues to recognize where things have gone wrong within that. So when you have the idea of the politics should be modeled on the family and the family should prepare one for politics, what assumptions are going into that idea of family and politics in the first place, and are those even worth being maintained? So filial piety, if you are raised in a family that is just a very toxic family, then I don't necessarily think that basic filial piety is worth maintaining. If it is damaging to your mental health or to your well-being in general, just the way in which the unfortunate structure of your family or the relationships developed within, then I don't think one should be expected to still maintain a basic respect, or of course basic respect for people in general, but they shouldn't be expected to make the well-being of their family front and center if their family didn't contribute to their well-being. It's all still in a process of change and circumstance and interpretation in that regard. There is no right or wrong way to apply what we've been talking about. If the way in which, that sort of critical thinking and openness changes the way in which you explicitly engage politically in a society, that's cool. If it changes the way in which you approach your relationships in your personal life, that's cool. But it's the disposition there. This is the big, you're a philosopher, tell me this question.
Yeah. And you can interpret the question or twist it in however way you want.
Well, I would say that the funny thing is that in my personal experience, you're less likely to get an answer out of that from a philosopher than you are about because a lot of philosophers say Heidegger, for example, he thinks we're asking the wrong question in the first place, or or that when we think we're asking the meaning of what the meaning of life is, we're not actually asking what it means. So in some ways, like, it's kind of funny of the popular image of philosophers as these people who are searching for answers, that because of that, they don't have any answers. Some part of me wants to say that, like, it's what you derive from it in that regard. Like, I don't have an answer to the meaning of life because of what I've said already, which is that, like, for me to prescribe like what the meaning of life is for me would be me imposing over you what my like narrow particular view of where I derive meaning from is. Whereas the best task in my mind that a philosopher can do is to empower others to answer that question for themselves. So like if you ask a philosopher what the meaning of life is, and task them with answering it, the best thing that philosopher can do in my mind is give the person who asked the question the tools to answer it for themselves. And that's like, so in that sense, it comes back to what we've talked about already. It's aporetic. But and in my mind, an answer that doesn't come from the person and is freely chosen by that person and understood and evaluated by that person is not really an answer, because if it's not something that because it's a question that affects everyone, like what the meaning of life is, if it's a answer that is provided by someone else in your stead, then even if it's absolutely true, it's not an effective answer. And so any sort of meaning of life necessarily needs to just so the task of the philosopher in that regard is not to answer the question, but to give people tools so that they can answer the question. But at the same time, maybe recognizing that there is no answer to the question, but that being the point. Or maybe there is an answer, figure it out for yourselves, will help along the way, I guess.
Would you say then, as a philosopher and an educator, that that's one of the ways that you view the meaning of your life, sort of to empower people, to teach people?
Yeah, of course, like it matters to me like what meaning I personally derive from life, but certainly the position I've put myself in by trying to break into philosophy and education, that factors into it. Like, because you want to think about like what you would want out of being educated, and try and provide that for other people. And I don't think anyone who's like invested in education for its own sake wants to be given all the answers. Well, people want to be given answers, but they don't want to just be given answers so that they can stop learning. They want to be given answers so that they can evaluate and choose for themselves which ones work for them. And in that regard, I see like philosophy education as kind of like a way of sort of like cultivating like an approach to education more broadly. It's about like engaging with students, empowering them to challenge you and to depart from your views and the views of the people that you're presenting, because ultimately like everyone has to enter into the discussion on the same ground, which is just as different people with different perspectives engaging with a topic that is open to everyone, and which fortunately in philosophy there are necessarily no clear answers. Not saying that like I don't believe there are answers, because there are some topics I believe that I like answers to certain big questions. But the very nature of philosophy has to be people figuring it out and reckoning with it for themselves. Just the day-to-day experience of of appreciating and creating, and learning and empowering others to learn. That's at the very least that's the sort of life that I derive meaning from. And so that at this stage, at the ripe old age of 23, is my definitive answer that I'm sure will change tomorrow, every day, and until I'm 90 and have all the answers for certain. read philosophy, study philosophy. If you can, of course. Start anywhere. Consume media in general. Talk to other people. You can probably learn more in a discussion with someone just about life in general than you can from like philosophy books sometimes. Which is why you can have the wackiest discussions at like parties or something like that with someone you've never met before. But yeah, be concerned with the world.